Well, continuing our coverage on President Biden's highly anticipated State of the Union address tonight, we're joined by Republican strategist and radio host Melik Abdul. Melik, you know we're going to jump right in there because I know you have a lot to say about this, but I need to ask you, what should Biden focus on in his State of the Union speech this evening?
Well, I think it's obvious that one of the things that Biden will focus on is his accomplishments. We can't deny that he's had a number of accomplishments. Of course, Republicans may not necessarily agree with those, but I think it's important for him to do that, especially talking about the midterms. I think one of the things that he has to be concerned about, obviously, is his poll numbers, but I don't think that that's something that's going to be a part of the State of the Union. He's going to talk about his infrastructure deal. He'll talk about some of the other things, whether or not he'll go into the Republicans as existential threats, I'm not sure. But considering the midterm results, I think that Biden does have something to talk about at this State of the Union. What Melik, is, I don't know.
Melik, you and I both know it's also going to be a very different scene with Speaker McCarthy over his shoulder, like leering, looking down the entire time. Will Biden put pressure on House Republicans to raise that debt ceiling in his speech?
Yes, he absolutely will. This will be a big part of his speech. How successful he is at convincing Republicans, I don't think that there'll be. One thing that we can be rest assured, I don't think that we'll have Kevin McCarthy ripping Biden's State of the Union speech as Nancy Pelosi did with Donald Trump.
I think I can agree with you on that. I don't see McCarthy doing that. But do you expect Biden to be aggressive towards Republicans in his address or focus on bipartisanship?
No, I expect him to be as aggressive as he was leading up to the midterms. Remember, we had Dark Brandon. He was going around talking about Republicans as existential threats. And so I do believe that he'll continue that theme. But keep in mind that these State of the Unions are very big. They're big and bold ideas, similar to what you see in political campaigns. So a lot of the things that Biden is going to push, for instance, like the billionaire tax, yes, it's very good with the base, but it has no chance of moving House Republicans and probably wouldn't even get out of the Senate. But he's going to propose it and a number of other big ticket ideas.
Melik, will that play better, though? You talk about that billionaire tax. Will that play better if he also juxtaposes it against, hey, you know, Republicans really want to cut Social Security. They want to go after grandma and grandpa's income.
Well, that's what he's going to say, because the theme out there, at least the narrative, it's not true, but the narrative is that Republicans want to gut Social Security and Medicare. I'm not convinced that Republicans or Democrats will be able to come to any type of consensus on those type of entitlement spending, because keep in mind, they represent the largest portion of the budget. At the same time, I'm not convinced that Republicans will actually concede to cuts in defense spending, which is what Democrats on the other side of the aisle would want.
And Melik, both of those are big, high ticket items. We know that. And we also know people don't feel good about giving up something once they have it. So it really becomes almost a Sisyphean task to even try to get that passed. But how can Democrats get excited with a divided Congress, unlikely to pass any of those things that we just talked about?
I don't think that they're going to be excited at all. Think about the last 2 years. There was a lot of disappointment on the Democratic side as far as things that they wanted the administration to do. And then Democrats were in control of not just the White House, but the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, with a divided Congress, literally nothing is going to get done. So I expect not just Democrats, I expect that you're going to see a lot of frustration on the Republican side as well, because there are a number of things that many Republicans assumed would happen if Republicans took control of the House. But I think they're going to get a lesson in how government does and does not work.
Melik, I want to go back to the debt ceiling. What do we do in a situation where we both know we don't want America to default on its credit card bill? What happens when we know both sides are like gridlocked in what we don't want to give up here, Democrats? Republicans said, hey, we got to cut something, you guys. What do we do to move forward?
Yeah, they're probably not going to be able to give much of a huge win. But remember, back in 2011, when this happened under the Obama administration, Obama did actually concede to some cuts. And we're talking about program cuts, but there were no cuts to entitlement spending. So I imagine that beyond the theatrics that you see, if there are any cuts, those cuts will be to things like certain programs at the Department of Education and other places. There won't be any cuts to Social Security or Medicare. I'm pretty convinced of that. that.
Malik,
but
last
I
question.
hope I don't have to eat my words.
Well, I'm hoping they don't cut it too. We know too many seniors who really need that income. So I'm hoping, like you, regardless of what side of the aisle you stand on, I think we know that our seniors deserve to at least live in some relative form of comfort. Before I let you go, should President Biden announce his intentions for 2024, or would you suggest that Uncle Joe leave that alone?
He absolutely should. Sure, the majority of Democrats don't want him to run again, but who else do you have? You have to come up with an alternative. And Pete Buttigieg and Gavin Newsom are definitely not an alternative. So Joe Biden, I think he should launch his campaign at the State of the Union. We know that he's going to run. And at this point, considering the midterm results and some of the accomplishments that he can duly claim rights to, I think he absolutely should run. So we're looking at a potential rematch of Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
Malik, are you suggesting that the Democrats' bench is weak?
Yes.
Melik Abdul, Republican strategist and radio host. Malik, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation in your cable lineup. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-based, unbiased coverage.